Center. I am Shawn, and it's delightful to have you here on this Saturday morning at 10 o'clock to paint. So I think that it's interesting that we can work with 6 oysters today. We are going to do it in a fun sort of loose style. As we begin to work on this image of the 6 oysters, we are going to paint the background space first. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a idea about how we'll progress, and then we'll get started with the colors that we have on our palette. We're actually going to use several different tools that aren't traditional necessarily for a painting that's a little bit smaller, but we are going to use the big brush to wash on paint. We're going to use sponges to move paint around, and then we'll go into more detail with the other brushes that we have. What I'm thinking of more of a traditional brush. We have bright brushes that are, we're going to say a large one and a small one, because that way we can make sure that you know the difference between the other brushes that we're going to use. The other one's going to be round. So at your place, you also have a water tub, and we'll use that a good bit. And during the time, if it needs clean, we'll certainly do that so that you have clean water to work with. We also have paper towels. The paper towels, I'd ask you to think about using this part. Instead of putting the paint that you don't need on the paper towel, if you'll just sort of open it up like a sandwich and put the wet paint inside the paper towels, that way you won't have it here, because as soon as you put it here, your fingers, every time you touch this, so don't wad this up, because every time you wad it up, you just carry the paint from one place to another, and it just helps keep your center set up and clean for you to use. So the colors that you have in front of you, these are right out of the tube, so I'll tell you about those, and then we'll talk about how we're going to change them. You do have a palette, the white waxed paper sheet that you have, and on this you're actually going to mix colors when you need to change colors. So, but right out of the tube, we have the colors that are easiest for you to recognize, of course, are white and black. So those are pretty easy to find. The two that get a little bit harder to see are the blue and the turquoise green. The turquoise looks black, but once you play with it a minute, you'll see that it is a green, but it is very close to the value of the black. And then we have a yellow ochre, which is actually a cadmium yellow that's mixed with brown, so it is yellow ochre. And then we have a burnt sienna, which is a brown that goes to the red side a little bit. And then we've got a medium green. Now I have other colors that we'll be adding as we get close to the end and sort of begin to tweak it to finalize and add some colors that might be, some people might like blues better, some greens, some more of the aquas. So as we get ready to tweak a little bit, then we can add those to your palette as well. So to start with, let's take and put this big brush into the water, and you don't need to dip the whole brush in. Think about it like this. If you think about using like the bottom half of your bristles, you don't need to wet everything, so you wouldn't want to dip everything in. But if you just dip it in so that you literally pick up water from about here down, that's enough water for us to do what we want to do with without you having a lot of drippy stuff. Now, you know that if you squeegee, of course, with like on your tub right here, if you just push it off like that, you can just drop the extra right in the middle. You can do it with your hand, your finger. You can just brush it right across your tub. We just don't want you to have a lot of, like, we're not doing a watercolor, so we're not carrying a lot of water, but we do want to have this so that it's wet and we can pick up paint. Now the first thing that we're actually going to do is we're going to use white right out of this cup. We're actually just going to take and we're going to pick up some white. Actually just going to scoop it right up. And we want this to have a color that's going to be grayish. So I just moved some over to the palette, and you can see it's just sort of a glob of it. And now we're going to talk about a new word that some of you may not have heard. It's called a smidgen, okay? A smidgen. And so what we want to make sure is that when you go over to get the black out, that you only get a smidgen.
But it's turquoise, not black.
No, we're doing this is the black one, not the turquoise.
I guess, I thought okay, all right.
So the turquoise we're not using right
The
now.
navy blue one is the turquoise.
It looks like that,
Yeah,
it
okay.
sure does.
Okay.
So this is the black one, and if you can't tell, you'll be able to in a minute,
Okay.
because but what we wanna do is we literally want to get a smidgen. And you can see the way I'm doing that is I'm just tapping the brush right on top of the paint, because if you go in, that's good. Now, to see how much you have on there, see how much I got by just doing that little smidgen? We don't want that much, okay? So that's why we're gonna put it over here on your palette. We're not gonna just put it on your canvas, okay? So once you have a smidgen, roll into the white, and you're gonna make just what I'm gonna call a gray. See the base that we have there? And you don't have to mix it in that you're gonna make a color gray, like our wall color. We're not trying to paint one wall color gray. We want it to be varied. We want this to be a real fun background, and we're just gonna scrub in the paint. Now you can tell with a couple of scrubs, it's gone, okay? It's used up. So now we have to go back and get more. And so now that you know what a smidgen is, you'll be able to go, and every once in a while, if you need more paint, you can go through and get it. And then you can adjust it by putting it on your palette to make sure that you get just enough. Now these are gonna be big, fun strokes. And of course, intentionally, we made the lines so that you don't have to worry about covering them up while you paint. And as you'll also notice that as soon as I used and you know, like put that much paint on my canvas, I'm out of water and I'm out of paint. So now you can go back in, you can dip into the water. And remember, it's important that you just barely dip in so that you're just getting enough water that it doesn't run everywhere. So now you have a process that we're gonna use so that we can actually cover all of the space that we're gonna consider is outside the oysters. So, as a review, you're literally gonna you're gonna go in, you're gonna wet your brush about halfway, and after you wet it, you're gonna go over and you're gonna get white paint out of the cup. You're gonna put it on the palette, and then as you paint, you're gonna put smidgens of black in, so that it is light enough that you consider it a light gray. And you're just gonna go around with your brush, not with any kind of rhyme or reason as far as how you paint it. A good technique to think about though is something that's like a crosshatch. This would make a real good background for this. Literally, you're just making an X where you're crossing over yourself, you're overlapping. That way you can see that you can get around the oyster. We are going to overlap and cover in more of it in a minute, but I just want to make sure that we get a pretty good idea about what's going on in the background space first. We don't want anything to be left without paint on it. And this painting is very loose. And if you want it to have a little bit more of a watercolor slide to it as far as it being loose and runny, you can certainly add more water as you go, but it's not necessary. We are doing acrylic. It will look lighter than most acrylic paintings that we usually do when we have a group party like this where we're all painting the same thing. The acrylics that we do in here usually have a full body or a heavy body paint to it. Now, as I begin to overpaint over the oysters, you can see that I am covering the line. I don't want us to feel like that we're painting in the lines necessarily, but I want you to keep the lines so that you can see it and that you don't have to redraw. So So now, once you have the background space basically covered with a white wash, we're gonna start gradiating it with a little more of black as we go. So we're going from a lighter gray to a darker gray. If you'll just make sure that you go in and that you get in between all of the oysters, because they do overlap, it's fine. Just put a wash of white paint right in between them, right on top of them. And once you have that, we are gonna start going a little bit darker, so that means that we're going to get a little bit more. This time we'll get like 2 smidgens of black. So in other words, it's a little bit darker. So now I'm carrying that much black. So I'm gonna begin in here by brushing in a very loose stroke of grays. It's very textured looking, it's very dry brush looking at first. Because the canvas is a little wet because of the brush stroke that we have on there already, you're just gonna be mixing. The darker gray is going to be closer to the oyster, so you don't have to go all the way into the background space, but you're going up more into the space around the oyster. We're not actually doing any of the shadows right now, but we will very soon. So just a little grayer to help give us a little more depth.
And you said keep this closer to the oysters.
Yes, ma'am, we're going closer to the oyster with a gray feel. And then immediately, like in just a second, we're gonna start getting it darker. But right now, we're just going to just a fun gray tone. We're gonna call like a middle value. And we're just adding more texture in. Okay, and that's all you need for that part. We just didn't want it to be one value of gray. We wanted it to have sort of a medium color in there in addition to that, so that we can, when we start adding the shadow, then we'll have a difference between the two. All right, we're gonna use this big brush before we retire it for the oyster. So if you'll get out a little more white, and we're gonna do more or less a little wash with the white like we originally did with the background. We are gonna do that in the oyster space. So the first thing I want you to do is just go in and put the white inside each one of the oval-like circles that you have. And this is more or less the lighter gray that we started with our background. Remember, you don't have to paint in the lines, but you're just adding enough of the color that you know that the canvas is covered. And then when we have fun brush strokes and things coming up in our oyster, that we don't have to worry about if we've missed any of the canvas. So keep adding white. Every once in a while, you can go over and get the water that you need to have it so that it spreads. So that's the lighter gray that's in the oval surface. And then once you get that in, we are going to scale down that brush so that you can just put it in the water and get it, just agitate it along the tub so that you can get most of the paint off the end of it. And then don't take it out of the water, just leave it over there in the cup. Just lay it down in the space that doesn't have any water in it, and it'll start just drying out so that we can move on to the next brush we want to get. So once you finish, just put it in the water just a little bit, drizzle it over, and then just take it over and lay it down on the side that doesn't have any water in it, and just leave it there. And the next brush we're gonna pick up is the larger brush that you have. That is a bright, which means it has a square bristle area. And we're going to come in and we'll start giving a little definition to the oyster shells. But we're gonna keep it very loose until the end. But the first thing I'd like us to find is the space outside the oval. And so, once again, we're gonna take white and we're gonna just scoop it out on our brush, just getting enough ready that we can take it back over to the palette. We're in the same space we were working in a while ago.
It's okay if it mixes with the
Oh,
black.
yes, everything can just mix right together. That's correct. What we wanna do now is we wanna pick up just a smidgen of the black. I'm putting it right next door to the white. And then I want to add a smidgen of brown, just a smidgen. You can see it's a very small amount. And as I begin to blend those together, I'm not gonna overmix because I wanna keep them all a little separated. I don't want it to look like we're trying to mix one color, but I do want the brown in it to distinguish the area that is separated from that oval shape. And literally with this brown brush, what I want you to do is go in and begin right outside where the oval shape is and start laying in the color for that. Now you'll have to get a little bit more specific somewhat as you approach the outside edge, of course. But what I want you to do is think about this as being very jagged, of course, like the oyster shell really is. So as you go toward your lines, toward the outside, just shape them with your brush. That's why we're using these oversized brushes to begin with. I just want to make sure that you cover your canvas and the color is a little bit browner and a little bit darker than what you used on the inside. But these are all still very much a part of the underpainting, and so I just want you to feel free just to sort of zig and zag around into that area. You can follow your lines that you have provided, but please don't feel like that you just have to paint in them because that's not necessary. But I do want you to sort of find the shape before we find our shadow in just a minute, because we're gonna put that in next. But I do want an underpainting where everything is basically painted with the color first. So I'm gonna do that to all 6 oysters. And that, of course, is the thing about painting with 6 things that are just alike. You do have to do a lot of repetition, but that's okay. That's why we're doing it. We can be very proud of it when we get it all in. But the color that's going in is a little bit darker and a little bit on the brown side. But if your shade doesn't look just like mine, don't worry about it. And don't worry about staying in the lines necessarily. Just get all the canvas covered and keep yourself a base so that you know where your oyster is. And if you're a real edgy, liney kind of person, you'll probably do a little bit more than what I'm doing. But that's the fun part about this painting. Until the very end, you do not have to be rigid or detail oriented at all. So just keep putting white and black and brown into your mix. And because you're not pre-mixing the paint, you certainly don't want it all the same color. Sometimes it's going to be darker, sometimes it's going to be blacker, sometimes it's going to be browner. And all that is very much intentional for us to make this painting very interesting. You can always tighten up a painting, but it's very hard to loosen one up and go the opposite way. So now the oysters are beginning to take form, and that's a very important part of this painting. Keep adding white. We're going to keep the same bright brush, and we're going to put it in water, and then we're actually going to go over to the black paint, and we're going to load the brush with black, and we're going to begin the shadows that you see under all the oysters. That'll begin the detail part of getting our oysters so that they lay down and they're not floating. We want them to be anchored. And if you'll notice, I'm using the width of the brush to go in and almost go around and make a organic, or it could be sort of geometric, I guess, the way you think about it. But I'm just using that part of the brush to go around and make the corners or the edges of the oysters. Now, some places need more than others based on the size and the way that the oyster is actually put in. But the first thing that we want to do, just to keep it consistent to begin with, is all of the spaces can use about a 1/2 inch of space, where literally you're just going around with the black and you're just forming the oyster shape. so that it is laying on top of the ground space. So literally with the big brush, the bright, you're gonna dip it in the water, you're gonna go in and you're going to load your brush with a dark-ish color. Black's good to start with, especially up against the edges, and then we can gray it in some instances. But when the oysters come together, you can see I'm just using the toe of the brush just to go in and make an edge that's a little bit thinner when I need to, or fuller if I need it. But literally I'm just going in and I'm finding the drawing that's hidden sort of in between the grays, and I'm just sculpting it right out of that gray so that I can find the edge of the oyster. So you can use both parts of your brush, the wide part and the toe, and literally you're just finding the space, and as you find it, mark it with a line, and then we will go back and do some of the gradations where it changes to a lighter color. But right now we're just doing pretty much the edge of the black. Now, once again, we don't want it like a paint by number so that you're doing everything exactly the same. Sometimes I'm widening it up and sometimes I'm thinning it. But as long as you're finding the form by creating a shadow underneath it, it'll be fine. We are gonna play into this line as soon as we find the shape. We'll play right into it and exaggerate it. We'll bring it out.
You said dip it in some water first?
Yes, ma'am. Anytime you start with the brush, if you'll dip it in the water, it will make the brush work better. If you have a dry brush and you put paint on it, it's really like rubbing the brush on sandpaper because of the texture that the canvas has. So it really does help to put the medium on it, and our medium is water because this is acrylic. So you know how many edges oysters have anyway. So just building those lines is really a pretty fun process to do, and it won't take nearly as long as what the process did a while ago of you filling in all the spaces, so that's a good thing. But we're just using the line of the brush to begin laying in the edges. And it just so happens that this is a very shadowed picture with the light coming in. There's a lot of shadow in here, and we'll start expanding on that in just a second.
And you're going around all of the oyster?
I am. Some of them we're gonna actually bleed out a little bit later.
Okay.
We'll talk about the light and where the light's hitting it. That's a very good question. But we will bleed some of them out. But right now we are finding all the edges of the oyster. You can see some of them come together
Yeah.
and just do whatever the line does. If the line just overlaps, then that's what you're gonna do. The direction of light is very important for any painting. Because this is sort of grayish.
I do too. It's very sweet. It's not as sweet as it could be. I bet that other one's sweeter.
As we begin to take the black out away from the oysters, we're gonna add new colors to our palette so that it will have a variety of colors in that space. The smidgens, of course, of color are gonna be important because we want it to be minimal, but we want it to have like a bluish gray color, a brownish gray color, and then sort of a golden brown. We're gonna use all of those. So literally, with your big brush, right in the middle of everything that you've just done, just pick up a smidgen of the gold, the yellow ochre color, pick up a smidgen of brown, and then a smidgen of the brighter blue that looks blue, not the turquoise, but just the blue color. And just lay those in an area so that we can mix it every once in a while with the black to begin to spread it out. I still have the black on my brush, I didn't wash it off. I just kept the black. But now I'm gonna go in and play in these 4 colors as I begin to paint. And this time I'm gonna use the side of the brush, and I'll show you all those colors again. We're gonna go in and literally we're gonna start laying the colors right against the black and then push them out. So let's look at what we're working with first. We have black that we just finished up going all the way around our edges. Now we're gonna add the burnt sienna, which is the brown. We're gonna put a smidgen of that out. Then we're gonna put a smidgen of the yellow ochre right beside it. We're just laying little piles of color. And then we're gonna go to the blue and put some blue in
Is
it.
this the one you're referring to?
Mm-hmm.
The dark blue?
Nope.
The turquoise?
Nope,
Or
the
red
other one.
Blue, blue.
Uh-huh.
Purple. Where, we have different colors, which one is
This one.
The brighter blue.
it? What's purple color?
Oh, you think it's not. That's blue. Yep.
So I'm sorry, yellow, brown, black, and blue.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So we have all of those around.
Okay.
So I said yes to your turquoise with, I shouldn't have, yeah. It's the bright blue. I see what you were doing now.
But no green.
Well, it's gonna
It
turn
turns
green,
green,
and that's
okay.
why we really don't need the turquoise right now, cause it's gonna turn a greenish color anyway.
White, should we add white?
We will, but we don't want, we're gonna water it down a good bit. We don't want them all blended together necessarily, okay? So, what I want your palette to look like this. I want you to go in and get a smidgen of gold and put it here by itself and leave it. Then I want you to put brown by itself. And then I want you to have blue by itself. Cause we're gonna use them all,
Okay.
but on the same brush, and they're gonna mix a lot, but don't want you to pre-mix them.
Got it.
So what's gonna happen is, on your brush, once you pick, like, while I was just picking them up to move them over to my canvas, now I have them all on my brush, okay? But I didn't mix them. So we'll do the process again in just a second, so don't worry. I'm just gonna show you what's gonna happen, and then we'll make it happen again, okay? So, once I go in, see how every time I flip my brush around, another color shows up?
Yep.
So that's what's so fun about this, is because it doesn't have to be a pre-mixed color.
Okay.
So, now that you know what you're gonna get, now let's think about how to get it again. Go in and get a smidgen of gold, get a smidgen of brown, get a smidgen of blue, and you already have black. If not, you can add more black. But while all those colors are on your brush, literally, you're gonna start into an area. Let's start right up in here where we've got a lot of shadow.
Okay.
While we've got all of those colors, literally we're going to use the brush and we're gonna start spreading it out. I'm gonna go back now and I'm putting a little water on my brush because I want it to spread. And I want all those colors to just start coming out into the painting. But very minimal, very minimal. So if you get color here and it looks greenish and it feels too green, look how easy it is. Watch what you're gonna do. I'm gonna dip in the water, I'm gonna dip in the black, and I'm going to come back and I'm gonna start making it look gray, because all the colors that you have on your brush are literally gray if you mix them together. So now adding a little white on it allows us to have a color, a beautiful color, but it is gonna be grayish, because if you mix the yellow and the brown and the blue together, it is gonna be sort of a greenish gray color, because that's what gold makes. If you mix the gold and the brown together with the blue, that's what you get. So we wanna begin pushing the color in and up, and right now we're working on the color where it has the most shadow area. This is gonna be the most of our shadow. Everything else on the top will have a lot less. But from basically here, this point, all the way to here, we're doing more work with the shadow. Don't even go anywhere else right now. We're just going from here to here. And we're gonna put some color in. It's gonna turn bluish sometimes. It's gonna turn greenish sometimes. And goldish sometimes, based on how much we actually put on our brush. So,
More white again.
yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I got my stuff really dark for some reason.
Okay. Well, you can't get too dark under here because it needs to be blackish anyway.
Okay.
But anytime it goes too dark, all you have to do is put the white right back in and it tops right back out. But right now, we're going pretty far out into the background space with the greenish, brownish shadow. Now, because it's black right up underneath it, when you start carrying those other colors in, they're just gonna mix together. And just go up right to the black and then turn around and keep going. Add more water to your brush when you need to push it together. If you want some of it to look like it has a little bit more brown in it, you just add brown some. Remember, this is a feel of sort of being a wash. The brown and the black that we have is, if you mix it, it's actually like a burnt umber color. And that is a great color for this background because you've got some of the brown in the oyster anyway. And so that'll really bring that out and tie the background space into the oyster space. Remember, this is a rough kind of sea, beachy kind of feel. So it doesn't need to be neat and clean looking. But anytime you feel like that you need to go back in with white, it's easy to add white and then watch what we can do. If we want to add this, look, see how pretty it is to put the white right back in and just paint the white in right on top where we want it to go. Just dip your brush in water and then dip it in the grayish white color that you used to paint your background space with a while ago. And then you can mix it out as much as you want. And that's actually the color that we're going with next to continue around the rest of the painting with the grayish tone. We've got the darks that we want for the oysters to be sitting in that space so that they feel grounded, so they're not floating. And then with the colors that you have on your palette, we're literally gonna keep using those, but we're gonna go around this time and we're gonna start around the sides. But this time you're gonna add white to the mix, so it's lighter than what it was before. It's the same color. And you're gonna go in and you're gonna overlap the black line a little bit, so you're just taking the edge off of it. We don't want it to feel like the oysters are outlined, and so that's the way to do it. With the colors that are already on your palette, just start painting around the oysters and take some of the edging away by making the color around it a little bit darker, and then by going in on the line so it starts disappearing just a little bit. So the shadow is around it, it's there. And then just spread your color. If there's a space where the two oysters are creating like a shape that looks like a triangle shape, then that space is gonna be filled in heavier and darker. So now I'm going in, adding a little more black and blue and brown in this area. And that corner is literally pretty dark compared to the other space. Keep going around, get to the middle, and you've got another shape that looks like a triangle that you're gonna fill in darkish. And then, of course, where the oysters meet, you can see that you have a dark space in the middle here that you're gonna fill in. Another like triangle shape. There's another triangular shape. It's gonna be darkish. And then everything else goes a little bit lighter. So I'll add white to the brush and then continue on around, just letting it get lighter as it moves out away from the oysters. And now I'm back where I started from. When you feel like you have enough paint or color or shadows around, I'd like for you to try using the sponge to sort of finish up this space. If you take your sponge and just dip it in the water ever so slightly, just to put moisture in it, and depending on how much in advance you use this, if this color is still wet, you can easily take the water and manipulate the paint so it moves and goes together where you want it to go. But if it's not wet enough for you, then you can take and you can dab it into the color that you want. Like you can go a little grayer or a little bluer or browner, and you can take that and start moving it around. If you want to get that look, some of you have a brush stroke going that's very constant, that's very linear. And if you're going linear, I don't want you to, feel like that you have to change it if that's working for you. But there is a way that you can paint in here and get coverage and get the mixing of the light and the medium and the dark grays without having to paint every section of your canvas. And so if you're doing linear with the brush, you might need to do linear with this as well. You might not be able to play around with it quite as much as it, if you were doing it in a different direction. But, if you wanted just to loosen up and have the background a little looser, and you could certainly do it with the gray. You could put a little bit of the gray color. I wouldn't use, too much white at first, because it definitely changes the look of everything. But if you needed it a little bit lighter in a few places, if you take and put the sponge in the water, put the white paint on it, and then you can have fun using it to finish the space that you're working in for the background. And then that's it. If you will take the same big bright brush that we were using a while ago, what we're actually gonna do first is we're gonna come inside to the oval space, and we're gonna use the black and the blue, and we're gonna start building the space on it so it begins to make the shell look like it is concave by making it darker around that space. These are all pretty uniform, but they won't look that way once we get all the circles built. Please don't feel like that you have to keep this exactly the same. So as you pick up the black, pick up then a smidgen of blue, and I'm gonna do this a couple of times, so you might just wanna watch a minute and then you can get started on it. But I washed in some black, I'm washing in some blue by just laying it right over that space. And then I'm gonna put a little bit of the gold in and a little bit of the brown in, just the same colors that we just worked with out here. A little more of the brown. And I'm starting on the outside building it, but I'm going like a little further this way with the blue, and then maybe concentrating a little bit more with the brown or gold over here. And then I'm gonna do the same thing with the white. I'm gonna put my brush in the white, pick up the white with the brush, and I'm just gonna start moving that together just the way I did in the background. And then you're gonna do the same thing with the sponge. You can easily go in, have that same idea of the continuation of it. But please don't feel like you're stuck in that shape. It just shows the form a pretty good bit, but don't feel like that because of all the different layers that it has in there. I don't want you to feel like that you're stuck in the middle. But it's basically gonna be building from the dark to the light as you go in towards the center. So once you start in the middle with the darker black color, you can pretty much see how you establish the shape. And then once you establish the shape, then just get a smidgen of the color. In this particular one, it has more of a blue cast to it. But then to balance out the blue so it's not too blue, then you mix in brown with it, or a gray tone with the black and the white mixed together. And then it's really just gonna be putting the brush to work to get the same feel that you had going in the mixture of the background. So we'll do that in each one of these shapes. They'll all be a little bit different based on how they're turned. So I'm gonna let you work on this one a minute, and then we'll work on them separately as we begin to move. But just take black, set up the space, following almost an oval shape, but not feeling like that you're trapped in it. Because if you overlap and overdraw and overpaint, you can see what a good feel that you get as you begin to move it around. If you try to stay in the circle, you're not gonna get that same feel. But you can mix brown more or gray more, depending on what you want it to look like. They all need to be a little different, but very similar. So we'll figure out what that means is when we get them all painted in.
And you didn't use any green, it just looks green.
It just turns green because of the blue and the yellow.
Okay.
Exactly. So if you don't want it to turn greenish, you could not put the yellow in at first and let the blue dry, or not pull them together while they're wet. This one, we're going to go in and we're gonna have the black or the darker space. I'm gonna start with at the bottom. We want this to fill in and be darker in that space. So with my brush, I put it in the water, and then I went over and picked up black from my palette, which also had blue and other colors in it. I think the biggest mistake that artists use, if they haven't been painting a long time, is they keep washing out their brush, or they keep going to a clean palette, and you really don't need to. So once you get into the black and put it in, make circles that are just, it's almost like a hit and a miss on going around in the circle, so that you're making that oval, but you're not making like an exact line. So you just go in and you sculpt the shape out. You really just build the shape. Then you start in with the other colors, like blue, so you can add those to your brush. And then once you get that in, add a little bit. Say this time you don't add any of the gold, but you just add a little bit of the brown. So I can put that in. And using just, I'm pushing the brush in and I'm scrubbing the colors together. I'm going outside the line enough so it doesn't feel like that I'm stuck in the line. Then, with the brush, you can go in with a little bit of white, a little bit of gray, and then you can pull it together. That way you've got darks, mediums, lights, but then you have also all the colors. But it looks very organic looking. It is an oyster, but just make sure everything curves in that direction so it feels like that.
Okay. Got it.